The only way they're going to open the strait is if they see a final cessation of hostilities. Not a ceasefire, but a final cessation of hostilities. The Iranians have shown military might alone, without a clear political endgame, will not work for the United States. And it's certainly not going to advance Iran towards any kind of flexible position here. The 15-point plans that are tantamount to capitulation for the Iranians it's just not realistic. You have to understand the past and what record you have and how that's interpreted through the Iranian lens, and understand that they're seeing the current moment through that historical context.
As the war in the Middle East risks escalating further out of control, regional countries are scrambling to secure a ceasefire between the US and Iran. Increasingly frustrated by his inability to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, US President Trump has taken to threatening Iran on social media, vowing to bomb it back to the Stone Age so that Iranians will live in hell if the strait remains closed. Iran's leadership has so far rejected Trump's threats, saying it won't reopen the strait in exchange for what it sees as a temporary ceasefire. In the meantime, tit-for-tat strikes on major infrastructure have widened to include economic and civilian targets, including universities, petrochemical factories, and power plants in Iran and the region, to list a few. As the conflict escalates, is there any chance for a negotiated settlement, or are both parties at risk of overplaying their hand and emerging worse off? To find out, I spoke to Ross Harrison, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute and author of the excellent new book, Decoding Iran's Foreign Policy. Ross, thank you so much for speaking to Middle East Eye today. I want to begin by asking you about the latest headline we've seen, that Pakistan has sent a ceasefire proposal to both the US and Iran. What do you make of this proposal and its prospects for success?
Well, I haven't, Tamara, seen all the details, but my understanding is there was a 45-day ceasefire. And I think the problem there is going to be that for the Iranians, they're going to be suspicious that this is going to be just a temporary respite in order for the United States and Israel to rearm. So I think their concern is going to be that a 45-day ceasefire will be tantamount, similar to the ceasefire that Donald Trump announced at the end of the 12-day war in June of last year. The Iranians are not going to want to give up any leverage that they have for the 45 days, lest the 45 days turn into a longer ceasefire that then would lead to some kind of further incursion or reignition of the conflict at a later date. So that really depends upon the details. Again, it's really hard to say what the Iranians and what the Americans will accept, because there's a lot of grandstanding going on both sides. But I know that given the lack of any real trust in not just the motivations, but even in the plans of the United States on the part of Iran, they will be very suspicious. And I think they will be very careful as to not give up the leverage they have with the strait while we're moving from a phase one to a phase two. So how that gets organized tomorrow is opaque to all of us at this point, I believe. But that's my initial thought, is that they're going to be very concerned about giving up any leverage prematurely.
As you mentioned, they're very reluctant to give up the leverage they've gained by controlling the Strait of Hormuz. And Tehran has said that it will not give up that control for what it sees as a temporary ceasefire. Do you think that from their perspective, the leverage that they can gain from using the Hormuz as a deterrent, as a source of revenue, is maybe more what they think they could gain from negotiations right now?
I think they understand, Tamara, that they need to negotiate at some point. Remember, one of the questions always is, what role does trust play in any kind of a negotiation during or after a conflict? Most parties in a conflict typically don't trust one another. So they have to be sure that they have the leverage and a deterrent capacity so that they can trust their own interests and their own capabilities rather than the motivation of the opponent. So I think in terms of the strait, I think they're going to be concerned that it would be much more difficult if they would somehow ease the traffic or ease the restrictions on the traffic. Remember, the strait is not completely closed anyway. There are select ships from non-aligned countries with the United States that are getting through. But I think the concern would be that if they ease the restrictions during a ceasefire on the flow of of ships going through the Strait of Hormuz, it's going to become much more politically difficult for them to close it once more. So I think they're going to believe that the only way they're going to open the strait is if they see a light at the end of the tunnel in terms of a final cessation of hostility, not a ceasefire, but a final cessation of hostilities. Now that could occur through some kind of a phased approach. Again, I can't comment on exactly what the Iranians would accept, but I know that's going to be important to them, that they have a clear pathway out of the conflict on a permanent basis before they would release the grip they have on the strait.
That's interesting because from what you're saying, it sounds like until they have that, as you said, confidence in their capabilities to ensure a permanent pathway, they won't look for that exit from the conflict. But President Trump seems to be believing the opposite, that if he just continues to strike these targets, continues to threaten obliteration, then the weakness of Iran's leadership will lead them to negotiate. So do you see a tension there between how President Trump believes he can force Iran to the negotiating table compared with what you believe their logic to be?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Tamara. I think the divergence, not just in the belief, but in the way in which each side sees this war has been profound from the very beginning. You know, the United States somehow believes that they can use military might to bend the will of the Iranians to the United States will. And I think what the Iranians have shown is that military might alone, without a clear political outcome, without a clear political endgame for the United States, will not work for the United States, U.S. interest, number one. I mean, that's the point the Iranians are trying to make, is that military might alone will not enhance the U.S. position. And it's certainly not going to advance Iran towards any kind of flexible position here. But I think what's important to understand here is that the Iranians have a history, Tamara, of showing pragmatism and believing that pragmatism and flexibility are construed or interpreted in Washington not as flexibility, not as pragmatism, not taken at face value, but that it's interpreted as weakness. And therefore, it's then used against Iran. And that perception works against any kind of real off-ramp here. Because, and we go back in history a bit, we go back to right after 9/11 tomorrow, the United States and Iran were working fairly closely against the Taliban in Afghanistan. Only within 30 days of that initiative of working together, I would say, because just a month or two later, President George W. Bush labeled Iran part of the axis of evil. And what that told the Iranians is that their attempt to work pragmatically with the United States on common interests was construed as weakness and gave the Americans the idea that they could exploit that on behalf of Iran. And there were even comments by, I believe, the then Vice President Dick Cheney saying, you know, men go to Baghdad, but real men go to Iran. So I think they're going to be very, very careful. Their belief system is that the United States' ultimate goal is regime change. And they believe that now even more than before, given the decapitation approach that's happened since the beginning of this war. So I think their view is that they cannot afford to show any flexibility until they see actual signs from the United States, palpable, actual signs that the U.S. has an intention to de-escalate too. And so the placement, the escalation in military activity in the Persian Gulf, the threats from the President of the United States tell them the opposite. They're not going to cower under the words of the President of the United States, because in the past, words and negotiation have led to aggression. So if they would somehow buckle and take the president's words seriously, I'm sure they're taking them seriously, but if they would respond in a serious way, their view would be that it would just lead to further aggression and they would be in a position of capitulation. Their goal is to basically stand firm until they see facts on the ground that show them that the United States wants to de-escalate and is not just going to use a ceasefire or a negotiation as a ruse. Because the last time they were in negotiation with the United States, in April till June of 2025, and in the months leading or the weeks leading up to this war, they were in negotiations with the United States tomorrow. And after those negotiations, the U.S. and Israel waged aggression against Iran. So they're going to be very careful on managing their own perceptions of threat and how they interpret the threat from the United States. And they're going to be very careful in trying to send the right signals to the United States that they too have a say as to when the war ends. President Trump can say the war is going to end in 2 weeks, 10 days. Their view is they're going to have a vote as to when there's a cessation of hostilities.
And as you say, they really do see this as quite existential, that any pragmatism could be interpreted as weakness and almost capitulation. Do you think there is a risk of potentially overplaying their hand? I mean, many comparisons have been made to the Iran-Iraq war, also seen as existential, lasting 8 years. And kind of the common narrative there is that we fought one war for 8 years, so we wouldn't have to fight plenty more wars since then. Do you think there's a risk here that, you know, they absorb so much damage from this war that they maybe miss the opportunity to negotiate from a point of strength?
That is a risk, Tamara. I mean, I think there's absolutely a risk that they believe they have a bit of an upper hand, and they have to walk a tightrope in terms of making sure. But I think a situation we're in today is that the rhetoric coming out of the United States and the potential military escalation tells them that they have more to risk by showing a weakening of their position. Now, if the United States would send the proper signals, consistent signals, that they really want an off-ramp and they're willing to make concessions, and the Iranians still stay firm, they're only going to set up some kind of a toll structure in the Strait of Hormuz with Oman, or they're going to keep fighting, then that would be overplaying their hand. Each side, I believe, in a conflict like this has to understand that they have to participate in giving an off-ramp, not just to themselves, but to the other. Their belief now is that there is a risk of overplaying their hand, but that risk is not as great as showing weakness at the wrong moment.
There's been a lot of discussion that with all these decapitation strikes, and notably that of the former Supreme Leader Khamenei, Ali Khamenei, that it has empowered more militaristic, more, as it were, hardline figures in Iran, particularly senior figures in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. Do you think that's an accurate reflection of the state of play inside Iran, that the IRGC is in control, and as it follows on from that Iran's approach will necessarily be more hardline? Or do you think the picture of leadership in Iran is a little more complex than that?
The one thing I think is important for your viewers to understand is that Iran, over the last decade or more, has increasingly become a securitized state with the IRGC in further control. And part of that, not all of it, part of that goes back to the marginalization of some of the pragmatic, we call the reform wing, after there was a negotiation with the United States and with the UN Security Council plus Germany with the JCPOA. And once the structure that held the JCPOA in place collapsed when the United States walked away from it in 2018, that led to a marginalization of what we used to call the reform wing, people like Rouhani and so forth. So I think what's happened since that time is that the regime has moved much more towards an IRGC-centric entity, even back to 2018. But under the fire of war and the crucible of war right now, of course, it has moved even closer. Because what's missing now, Tamara, is a strong supreme leader. Remember, Ali Khamenei, in some ways, was able to balance the interests of the Revolutionary Guards against the interests of the elected government. So in some ways, you could see him as a moderating influence. He was ideological, but in some ways, he showed a lot of pragmatism. Right now, We don't know what state Moshtaba Khamenei, the new supreme leader, is in, but we can assume right now that he, if he's important at all, that he's basically being driven by the interest of the IRGC. Remember, this is a country that is at war, and so in any time of war, particularly a country like Iran that has been preparing for this kind of conflict now for decades, the folks that are in command are the folks that are responsible for protecting the sovereignty of the country, and that's certainly the IRGC. Now, what that means tomorrow going forward, we don't know. There are some suggestions that because the more militant wings of the IRGC are in command, that necessarily militates towards Iran moving in a more militaristic direction after the war and in a more repressive direction. Those kinds of predictions, I would say, I wouldn't take them very seriously, because there are various ways in which even the current crop of leaders, if they survive, there's different options that they have for moving forward after the war. But right now, I think it's a fair depiction to say that this is an IRGC-led government.
I am interested in what you said about the different paths of moving forward after the war. There's been an assessment which we've discussed before, the idea that, the IRGC, their relative power in the Iranian system has increased during this war because of the security threats. And, that could endure for a while if they fear future attacks by the US and Israel, if they feature some armed revolts from ethnic minorities in and around Iran, that could continue to elevate the importance of security for some time. And yet their absolute power at the same time has decreased. They're increasingly isolated in the region. They've had a lot of key infrastructure targeted that could continue to be targeted. That's vital kind of economically, industrially. Do you think the need to repair that diplomatic and economic damage could act as something of a moderating force on the IRGC's decisions? So ultimately, if they've lost, their sanctions evading networks in the GCC, if they've lost some of their regional allies, if they're losing some key infrastructure, do you think that after the war, that loss of power will invite a rethink of their current strategy?
Certain wings within the Islamic Republic, the governing structure, already before the war, believed that there was a need for some kind of a rethink. Because remember what was happening before the war. In the aftermath of the October 7th attacks, the degradation of Hezbollah, the weakening of the axis of resistance, the 12-day war, there was a sense that Iran's deterrence and their ability to operate geopolitically had been degraded. And then if you combine that with the protests that occurred in just early in this year, I think there was a sense that both internationally and domestically, the Islamic Republic had reached a certain, I don't know about an end, but an inflection point. So even that was true even before the war. So I think after this war, going back to the old days of trying to resurrect the old model of deterrence, I think they recognize they can't go back to the old days. Now, how they put together a new social contract, how to use that to strengthen their position within the country and try to rebuild a modicum of legitimacy, if it's possible at all, within their own population, and then also figure out a way how to perpetuate the deterrence that will have come out of this war, or rebuild it or build upon it, is something that they're going to have to do. But I think if you look back historically, Tamara, to what happened to Iran during the Iran-Iraq War of 1980, 1988, after Iraq invaded Iran, they went into that war with a very strong principlist or ideological position on fighting the war, almost a sort of a fanatical kind of way of fighting the war. And they were in a moment of a sort of a revolutionary fervor when they were fighting this war. They came out of the war in a much more pragmatic position with the likes of Rafsanjani and other leaders. And they realized at the end of the war that they had to build their society, rebuild their society after the losses, and they had to act pragmatically with the international system. Even though almost the entire international system and regional system, except for Syria, basically sided with Iraq. They knew they had to build some kind of a pragmatic pathway back, and they did it. So my hunch is that the same kind of considerations will be debated in Tehran. I think they're going to be faced with the reality, as you stated it tomorrow, even though their relative power relative to other centers of power in the country may have been improved, their absolute power relative to their former military power and relative to other states in the region is something that they're going to have to face.
Interesting. So from what you're saying, it sounds like even though the US and Israel don't seem to have achieved the regime change they were hoping for, the bases of power for Iran's leadership in terms of both foreign deterrence and domestic legitimacy at home will change after this war, from kind of the relying on ballistic missiles and the nuclear program and regional alliances and kind of relying on a clerical, religious legitimacy at home. You think both of those pre-war assumptions will change coming out of this war?
Well, I think there was already a pre-war assumption that those things had run its course. The war will just push them in an accelerated way to face the realities of those. As long as Ali Khamenei was alive, the likelihood of a complete rethink, even though there were elements within the government that were rethinking Iran's domestic position and their international position, while Ali Khamenei was alive, there was little opportunity for change, significant change. At the end of this war, there will be opportunities. What pathway the Islamic Republic, if it survives, takes is open question. But there will be, I think, opportunities, and there will be multiple pathways available to them.
Lastly, Ross, before I let you go, what is one thing you would say that you think is a commonly overlooked facet of Iranian thinking, of Iranian strategy, of the reality on the ground? What is something you wish more people enacting and commenting on this conflict knew about Iran?
Well, tomorrow when I was in Doha just a few days ago, there was a comment that was played to me, I believe, that Donald Trump or somebody in the administration said the Iranian negotiators are very strange. And I think that shows that in the White House now, which seems to be devoid of any real advisors that understand Iran at all, I think there's a complete misunderstanding of the Iranians. And I think what I would say to the President of the United States is, if in fact you really want to have a ceasefire, there needs to be a consistent set of messages to that effect. Both back channel and the public messaging need to say that the United States is ready to be serious in negotiating into this war. The 15-point plans that are tantamount to capitulation for the Iranians it's just not realistic. If in fact the United States wants an exit here, what the Iranians are going to be looking for, in order for them to consider being flexible and pragmatic, is a consistency of messaging and actions, provided it's clear that the United States is willing to make a departure from its past as well. And remember, the past that Iran has is that they had a deal with the United States called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that was a workable deal that the Iranians were complying with between Iran and not just the United States, but the international, almost the entire, all permanent other members of the Security Council plus Germany. And that was Donald Trump that came and tore that deal up and applied maximum pressure. So they had a deal with the United States and it was torn up. And basically, from their perspective, the United States waged economic warfare against Iran. And then twice more, in 2025, there were negotiations on the nuclear file, and in 2026, and both times it led to further aggression. So what I would say to the president is you have to understand how the Iranians think. If you want to see and test out whether in fact the Iranians are willing to be pragmatic, you have to make a departure from the past and send them the proper signals. And it needs to be reflected also on de-escalation on the ground. That, and that they're willing to basically put pressure on Israel as well, something we haven't talked about tomorrow, put pressure on Israel to send the same kind of signal. You have to understand the past and what record you have and how that's interpreted through the Iranian lens, and understand that they're seeing the current moment through that historical context. real lives are being affected in this conflict. And I think it's important that there be some kind of diplomatic initiative that creates the possibilities that each of the parties in this conflict can walk away from this conflict and understand two things. One is that they have perhaps gained something that they can claim with their own populations, but also that this should not happen again. If you had told somebody in Europe in 1943, when the Second World War was raging, you had told them that within a 10-year period, there would be some kind of a regional framework called the European Coal and Steel Community that tied together the various countries in the region, that would eventually lead to a European Union, you would say you can't get there from there. So I think what this war should signal to regional actors and to global actors is this region needs some kind of overarching security framework. The frameworks of the past that somehow countries have to collectively array themselves against one other actor, those kinds of formulas won't work any longer. There has to be, in order to avoid the kind of carnage that this war has already created, and hopefully will end soon, there has to be some kind of revisiting of a security framework that includes the interests of all parties, that this region needs that. It's missing. The interests of the global community at stake, the interests of the regional communities are at stake, and the interests of the populations of all the countries are at stake. And hopefully, if there's any silver lining at the end of this war, there will be some kind of collective action to get to that point.
Ross Harrison, author of Decoding Iran's Foreign Policy and senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, thank you so much for making the time to speak to Middle East Eye today. It's always a pleasure to hear your insights and your analysis, and hopefully we'll be speaking again soon.
Thank you, Tamara.